If you've watched the previous videos, you will now understand how a scoping review is different from a systematic review, and that both have different purposes. This is also reflected in the nature of their objectives, and the types of questions they can address. As with systematic reviews, scoping reviews should have a clearly articulated objective and question. There may be more than one of each. What is the difference between an objective and a question, and what kinds of objectives and questions can a scoping review address? In this video, we'll briefly discuss this topic. The objective is essentially the rationale behind why the review should be conducted in the first place. As such, the objective should be clear, succinct, and be able to convey to a reader what the review will add to their knowledge in the field or the topic under examination. While a traditional systematic review may seek to establish the comparative effectiveness of an intervention, a scoping review will generally have a broader purpose and focuses upon the descriptive characteristics of the included sources of evidence, rather than aiming to combine and analyze data to generate a synthesized overall result. In order to define your objective, think about what it is you're trying to understand about the topic you're reviewing. If you want to know how effective an intervention is, it's likely that you will need to conduct a systematic review comparing the intervention with others in terms of one or more outcomes. But what if you don't know what all the interventions that have been used to treat a particular condition are, and you're interested in knowing whether there are different types of people who receive the intervention, or ways that the intervention can be administered, or what different outcomes have been examined? Further, what if you are also interested in how research has been conducted on your topic of interest? Maybe it's an emerging topic with very few studies that all use different methodologies. Maybe the terminology use is inconsistent, or maybe different fields and disciplines use different interventions and approaches, and so are difficult to compare. A scoping review is able to account for this variation by allowing you to broaden your objective considerably wider than a traditional systematic review. So an initial scoping review objective may be to simply examine the nature of a body of evidence in relation to one or more of these factors. To provide an example, a scoping review may seek to explore the concept of nurse-led models of care in the field of chronic disease management. This is easy to articulate as a clear and concise objective that tells the reader why the review is being done and gives an indication of what they will learn through reading it. For example, nurse-led models of care are an emerging approach across a number of areas to healthcare. The objective of this scoping review is to report on nurse-led models of care in chronic disease. The review seeks to examine whether there are different types of nurse-led models, the kinds of chronic disease care where nurse-led models have been used, and what facilitators and/or barriers have been reported relating to the success or failure of the model. Now we can easily articulate the questions the review must pose in order to meet this objective. What nurse-led models of care are used to manage chronic disease? What chronic diseases have been managed using nurse-led models? What has been reported to be a facilitator for the success of these models? What has been reported to be a barrier to the success of these models? Based on this objective and question, we can now start putting together inclusion criteria for the review, the elements or factors that must be present in each source of evidence for it to be eligible for inclusion in the review. To do this, we simply break our objective and questions down into their component parts. For example, nurse-led models of care, chronic disease, facilitators of success, and barriers to success. In this example, each of these elements could be thought of as a concept. It might be helpful at this stage to also think about the notion of primary and secondary questions. For example, to meet the main focus of our objective, we would want only to include sources of evidence that relate to nurse-led models of care in chronic disease management, but we may not expect all sources of evidence to report facilitators and barriers to success. So instead of stating that all sources must include information on facilitators and barriers to success, we can boil it down to the two main concepts, nurse-led models of care and chronic disease. It becomes one of the items in the inclusion criteria of our review, the concept, the essence of what the review will focus on. We also now only need to include papers that include information relevant to these two concepts. However, because we still have these two secondary questions that focus on barriers to and facilitators of success, we will remain vigilant for data relating to these two other concepts when we examine our included studies. This will be discussed more in another video relating to extracting and presenting data in scoping reviews. At the stage of thinking about inclusion criteria, we may also decide to keep the objective and questions broad, or decide to focus them in somewhat. This might be because of the size of the literature, the importance of being specific about a certain part of the available evidence only, or because the broader objective may be beyond our capacity in terms of time and resources. For instance, if the review must be completed within a certain time limit. So how do we do this? By adding in new elements of the inclusion criteria, which in turn slightly alter our objective and questions. For example, we may only be interested in nurse-led models of care in higher income countries, due to the fact that healthcare in low to middle income countries tends to be affected by contextual factors that aren't as strong in other contexts. So we can change the objective. The objective of this scoping review is to report on nurse-led models of care in chronic disease in high-income countries. This narrows our focus and limits the sources of evidence that we will include in the review. This is another item for the inclusion criteria of the review, the context. We can add other contextual elements too, temporal, thematic, or geographic, for example, in the last 10 years, or in primary healthcare, or in Australia only. Another way of narrowing the focus of our review is to add another element to our inclusion criteria. A commonly used element relates to population. It isolates a particular group we want to focus on specifically. This is a frequently used element in traditional systematic reviews. So let's say that we're only interested in focusing upon women, and specifically women with chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, COPD, because we know that the disease disproportionately affects women more than men. Our objective will, again, need to be refined. The objective of this scoping review is to report on nurse-led models of care for women with chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder in high-income countries. By the end of this refinement process, we now have a clear objective, 2 primary questions, 2 secondary questions, and 3 types of inclusion criteria: population, concept, and context. This is the scoping review version of the commonly used acronym in systematic reviews: population, intervention, comparator, and outcome, or PICO. There are 3 other important things to note at this point. 1. Scoping reviews don't necessarily need to have every component of the PCC accounted for. Remember, our first objective didn't specify a population or a context. The nurse-led models of chronic disease management could have focused on anyone or refer to programs in any context. 2. While scoping reviews are broader, reviewers still need to be very specific in terms of defining their inclusion criteria. For example, we would still need to make sure that we clearly define nurse-led model of care, high-income country, COPD, and indeed whether we are interested in sources of evidence that include women of any age, who also may have comorbid diseases or conditions that might change the nature of the evidence. 3. Scoping reviews are not necessarily limited to research evidence only. For example, there may be sources of evidence that discuss nurse-led models of care for women with chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder in high-income countries that aren't based on research, don't present data per se, but instead focus on describing a nurse-led model of care and how it was developed. A source of evidence like this may contain useful data that hasn't been generated through a research process and can be legitimately included in a scoping review, unlike most traditional systematic reviews.